In this third video on the history of American recreation, we'll cover the period from the beginning of the 20th century through World War II, the first half of the 20th century. As the 20th century dawned, sports, of course, continued to grow. Ice hockey, which had been around in colder climates for years, formalized modern rules in Canada. And out of a number of athletic associations came competing professional leagues, and in the early 20th century, the National Hockey League Association was created. The National Hockey Association, of course, evolved into the National Hockey League, or the NHL, which had teams in both Canada and the United States. Baseball also continued to grow. While earlier in the 19th century Victorian age, the National American League champions had begun to play at the end of the season to determine who was the best, in 1902 the two leagues began a more formal alliance, which established the dominance of these two leagues over the other leagues, essentially creating the other leagues as a minor leagues. The 1902 agreement also formalized player contracts in the championship game, which was known as the World Series. The first World Series was played in 1903, but the National American Leagues continued as separate economic enterprises until they officially merged in 2000 to become Major League Baseball. Also, as the 20th century began, it became obvious that Walter Camp's rule changes in football had, unfortunately, ensured even greater collisions. In fact, in what became known as the Crisis of 1905, nearly 20 players died. As people considered abandoning the game, President Theodore Roosevelt invited college representatives to Washington, attempting to save the game. TR argued it was a manly game that should be saved. It was the first instance of football being tied directly to players' masculinity. With TR's encouragement, a number of reforms were adopted. Three important developments took place. First was the idea of a neutral zone to allow the ball to be set after each play. Second was the invention of the forward pass. The last major development was the creation of the National Collegiate Athletic Association, or the Ncaa. It was first an informal rules body between colleges to set standards to keep people from getting hurt and to prevent cheating. But by 1910 it had expanded and adopted its present name, now consisting of almost 100 colleges and universities. The Ncaa began to organize championships and hold tournaments soon thereafter. In the progressive era, football continued to grow. The first helmets made from leather appeared, as did the first primitive pads. Athletic associations began to charge spectators, and soon a professional league, the National Football League, operated in an area of Pennsylvania and Ohio, which becomes sort of the center of the sport. Now, this National Football League wasn't the NFL of today, however, and it soon folded. A number of professional leagues then began to form, but again, most ultimately failed. In 1920, a new league, however, the American Professional Football Association, was founded in Canton, Ohio. The first president of the league was the famous Jim Thorpe. By the 1920s, the league had over 20 teams and had changed its name to the National Football League, the beginnings of the NFL that still exists today. The National Football League played its first playoff game in 1932, where the Chicago Bears defeated the Portsmouth Spartans. In 1936, the NFL held its first college draft. You can see that on the right bottom here. College football had grown tremendously, profitable for the colleges, but under the auspices of the NCAA. Schools began forming conferences in the late Victorian era, and by the 1920s, games included huge crowds. Winners of conferences would play at the end of the season to determine whose champion was the best. These games were held in such large stadiums that they looked like bowls from the new airplanes that were flying overhead. People began to refer to them as bowl games. Sports writers and coaches voted on All-Americans and elected a national champion. There was so much money in professional sports that gambling and scandals were inevitable. In the 1919 World Series, there was the infamous Black Sox Scandals, where members of the Chicago White Sox team were accused of taking money from gamblers to throw the game. The 8 players were acquitted, but were nevertheless banned from the league. Bruised by the allegation, the National American Leagues agreed to a commissioner to oversee the operations to ensure the game's integrity. In both football and baseball, competing leagues can still try to operate. And in 1922, one competing baseball league sued the National League as monopoly. In the Federal Baseball Club versus National League, the Supreme Court ruled famously that baseball's, quote, exhibitions, unquote, were not a business that was subject to federal interstate commerce regulations. The ruling seemed to ignore the tremendous profits and the big business that professional sports had become, and even college sports, of course. The Roaring Twenties transformed American culture, shedding Victorian culture and expanding recreational opportunities. Fads were particularly popular. In the 1920s, for example, a new fad was the crossword puzzle. With the booming 1920s economy, people had more discretionary income. Also, with the spread of radio, a celebrity culture grew, making national heroes of sports figures in a way as never seen before. The best example in the 1920s was the baseball player Babe Ruth, who had a long-standing home run record. He's shown here. In college football, there was a legendary coach, Newt Rockne, at Notre Dame, and that kind of got Notre Dame established as one of the best football programs in the country. Boxing exploded in popularity as people gambled on the game. The most famous fight of the 1920s was in 1927, the famous long count fight, a fight between Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney. And when Tunney went down, there was a very slow count by the ref, and people listening on the radio, they were heart attacks, a flood of heart attacks all across the United States. Challenging the notion of Victorian gender expectations, Gertrude Ederle swam famously across the English Channel 23 miles, a feat that very few men could do. But the 1920s remained, of course, a sexist time. There was a hotel with declining business in Atlantic City, and the owner decided that he would get men to come to his hotel by holding a beauty pageant, one woman from each state. And the patrons of the hotel would vote on it. And this was the first Miss America pageant shown here. The movie industry, which had been established in the Progressive era, exploded in the 1920s. Opulent movie so-called theaters, increasingly air-conditioned, grew around the country as technological advances increased. The movies, of course, created a number of movie stars. For example, the comedian Charlie Chaplin on the left, or the dramatic actor Rudolph Valentino on the right. The first so-called talkie movie with sound was The Jazz Singer, which came out in 1927. By the late 1920s and the early 1930s, the first color movies appeared. And of course, you're seeing The Wizard of Oz here, which was in the early 1930s. Like sports, the movie industry became just dominated by big companies. It had grown into such a huge business, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, for example, being one of them, the famous lion howling. A problem for the 1920s was that Prohibition, a reform passed during the early Progressive era and following the temperance movement of the late 19th century, remained in force. So after World War I, people wanted to drink, and it was still technically illegal. So people in the 1920s began to brew their own alcohol, while the so-called bootleggers brought more. They would wear loose pants and strap on a bottle of liquor around their shins, and they'd call them bootleggers. Any 19th century or Victorian notion that alcohol was lower class had clearly evaporated. People were drinking across the class boundaries. During the Prohibition era of the 1920s, there were illegal bars called speakeasies. People would say, speak easy about it. Don't go spread it around. We don't want the police. The beginning of the Great Depression in the 1930s, that made people want to drink even more, and it sort of heralded the end to Prohibition. The 21st Amendment ended Prohibition in 1933. After Prohibition, in an ironic twist, alcohol use increased more than before Prohibition, with women now drinking and smoking in public and in bars like men. Of course, in the Great Depression of the 1930s, some of the more expensive leisure activities of the Roaring Twenties came to a rapid conclusion. In the 1930s, the popularity of board games, always inexpensive, grew, most notably with the game Monopoly, an obvious outgrowth of the challenging economic times. You can see an original version here on the picture. When World War II came in 1941, the United Service Organizations, or USO, was created to entertain the troops, and they would bring comedians and musicians to overseas bases to entertain them and keep the morale up. Back stateside at home in World War II, many sports suffered because the men were fighting overseas. To maintain profits, a women's professional baseball league was formed in 1943 called the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. It was a success and operated until the early 1950s. It was a forerunner in professional women's sports. In any event, this concludes the third video on the history of American recreation, looking at the period in the early 20th century up until World War II.